ANZ is predicting forced sales. Let's have a look. Good morning, everyone. Florian.heise here, and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. I thought today we'd have a look at an article sent to me by a viewer about struggling borrowers and the fact that they need to consider selling. So, a nice way of ANZ warning that forced sales will materialise. So I encourage you all to pick up your stein, pick up your morning coffee, and let's sit down and relax and have a look and see what the media is telling us. So, this is from the Sydney Morning Herald. It's by Clancy Yates. Struggling borrowers will need to consider selling. This is from the ANZ. Now, I was watching, I think, Channel 9 or one of the stations was saying up to 25% of people are considering selling. Some people are considering getting money from family. Some people don't know how they could survive without the job keeper or the inflated job seeker. Some people are living really close to the edge. They've never planned for a disaster, everyone. Because this is a disaster. This is a disaster. Sure, the lockdown is enforced by the government, but it is a disaster. It's completely unpredicted. Now, what's concerning, what's worrying is that a precedent has been set. So it could be a more frequent disaster. It could be more frequent than natural disasters with the government locking down the economy. So let's have a look at this, guys. One of ANZ Bank's most senior bankers says some borrowers who are unable to meet their mortgage payments will need to consider selling their properties in the coming months, warning it would not make sense to continue accruing interest. Well, yes, that was an interesting point in this news segment where they're talking about if you had a $500,000 mortgage and you deferred it for 10 months, you'd be paying an extra $128 a month for the outstanding 25 years of your mortgage. And my instant thought was just pay more later, but some people can't. Some people are so close to the edge, they've budgeted to the dollar. It could be an investment property, they're depending on the rent, or maybe they're not even paying any capital and going interest only. How did we get to this mess, everyone? How did we get to such a mess where so many people in our country are living so close to the wire? Has it been because we've had nearly 30 years of no recession, where every genius is telling you that property only ever goes up? It'll never go down. Because they've got no living memory of a recession. And the people who are old enough, they've probably forgotten. Because usually they're so invested in property, their entire identity and being and all of their business success comes from property. So it'd be hard to even contemplate any prospect where it could falter. And now the banks are continuing their mortgage holidays out until March. I suspect it's so they can go and give someone a tap on the shoulder, going, hey, Florian, you need to sell, mate. Get rid of it. Now, you've got a few months. I suspect that's why. What do you think, everyone? Do you think it's the banks being benevolent and nice because they're our friends? Or it's just trying to mitigate the pain that occurs to their assets? Australian banks have allowed about 10% of all mortgages to be deferred in response to the pandemic. And this week, lenders said some borrowers could have up to 10 months without making payments if needed. Well, it's the response to the economic interventions to mitigate the spread of the pandemic. We need to be clear about the differences here. I mean, because if you contract the illness and you receive treatment, what's the worst case? Well, worst case is death. But that's usually at a much higher age where you're probably not working. Where if it's a normal person who's working, I mean, you take a few weeks off, a month off. Do people not even have a reserve of a month? Well, they probably don't, do they? There needs to be a real push out of all of this. There needs to be a cultural shift in our nation where people save, where people have an emergency buffer, where it's pushed into the younger people. You know, Australia is a multicultural nation. We've got cultures that really emphasize delayed gratification and long-term saving. Usually that's because they've emigrated from countries where you can't trust the state. Maybe that's something we all need to adopt now. In an interview on Friday, ANZ Group Executive of Retail and Commercial Banking, Mark Hand, predicted more customers with deferred loans would resume making payments in weeks ahead, notwithstanding a further rise in deferrals in Victoria. However, he also emphasised that interest was still being capitalised on the deferred loans, and there was a risk that some customers could dig themselves deeper into trouble by pausing their payments for too long. We're not forgiving repayments. The interest is being capitalised. So whilst interest rates are low, the debt that you have at the end of the deferral period is higher than what it would otherwise have been. So that will put a strain on the cash flow of a family or a business, he said. Here's an interesting thing, another good story. Because people, I put a call out for you to share your stories of beating the banks. And one gentleman mentioned that they'd paid off their loan, but they just kept it on there just in case they need it. Just in case they need access to that money. And I can understand that. It's a lot less of a hassle having to redo the paperwork. What if an opportunity came up and you needed the cash? What if there was a disaster occurred and you wanted to draw on the capital? Now, or on the equity that you've got in the house. And of course, every year you have to pay a fee. Like we pay some BS, I don't know, $400 fee. I just consider it part of the interest payment that they dress up as a fee. And it gets higher every year relative to the mortgage. But nonetheless, he was paying this fee every year, and he said, and now he always calls up a few times a year to say, well, why are you charging a fee? There's nothing here. And this time, normally they just fob him off. This time they gave him it, wrote off the fee. Said, no fee, don't worry, stay with us. While the property market has not crashed, he said the outlook for prices was uncertain, and some borrowers would need to consider selling. The growth that you might have anticipated might not come, so at some stage, you're going to have to say, if I can't afford this mortgage, am I better off to rent, put my capital aside, and wait until I'm in a better position to buy back into the market? And that is some good advice. It's harsh advice. A lot of people won't be able to hear it. There's a stigma with renting in Australia. Rent money is dead money. You know, in some ways, if you're renting, you look down upon. And renters, well, it's been a landlord's market, hasn't it? Renters have had constantly increasing rents, but that's all suddenly shifted now, hasn't it? So the bad landlords are going to learn some harsh lessons. Oh, maybe lessons with the lash. I just think there are people who are going to have to make those decisions in the next few months. Amid concerns about the economic damage unleashed by Melbourne's return to lockdown, Mr. Hand said he expected a rise in the number of people taking advantage of an emergency scheme to pause payments on housing and small business loans. I think people are more educated now, and this lockdown will create, another spike in requests in Victoria in particular. Melbourne was this week put back into a lockdown to contain a worsening outbreak, and on Friday, ANZ Bank economists predicted the shutdown would dent the recovery, as the city accounts for about a fifth of the national economic output. Mr. Hand said, while some business customers would manage, for others the emotional and financial strain might cause them to pull the pin, he said. Cafes and city restaurants could be especially hard hit, as largely deserted office towers hit spending, such as on business lunches. So a viewer sent me some images from yesterday going to lunch in Melbourne. And let's have a look at these photos he took. You can see here, look at just how dead the streets are, how cold Melbourne is. That's another thing entirely. But, would you want to have a restaurant or a cafe right now, depending on foot traffic, if this is what the city is like? And these were taken yesterday, everyone. So you can see Melbourne is completely dead. And that would, there we go, there's a business. That would have to pull or push some people over the edge, or maybe an anchor pulling them down. It'd be tough. Restaurant game is tough enough already as it is, particularly in Melbourne. So some of those customers, I think, will say, I just can't see how I can trade my way out of this, and will be wise enough to cut their losses. So some will just have to liquefy. So it's time to keep an eye out on the auction websites. How's that going to all work? Mr. Hand, who has been working at home for 16 weeks, said 9% of ANZ's mortgages had been deferred. However, he said the bank's data suggested as many as 2/3 of customers with deferrals had not seen a drop in their income, and the number of people resuming repayments would rise in weeks ahead. ANZ Bank will provide more detail on how the deferrals are affecting its bad debts at a market briefing on August 19, when it will also update investors on dividends, which it suspended in May. After the recent deterioration in Australia's relations with China, Mr. Sahan said he had not seen evidence that this was directly worrying the bank's small, medium enterprise clients, but some had moved to diversify their exposure to other countries in the region, such as Vietnam. So there we have it, everyone. Predictions and concerns of essentially forced sales. Now, how is that going to affect the property prices? Remember property? That always goes up. Remember how people are saying the worst is behind us? There's even discussion of a trough, that we've hit the bottom of this recession. We haven't even... It feels like we haven't even seen the real impact of the recession. The government is just stepping in so much. This didn't happen in the last recession, everyone. We haven't experienced the recession yet. Let me know your thoughts and opinions. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you're a fan and you want to support the content I create here, there are a few ways you can. You can join the channel on YouTube or Patreon. You can support us using our affiliate links at Amazon, eBay, Independent Reserve, or Kucoin. You can buy a merch from HeiseSays, use Gold Pass from the Perth Mint, or support us via PayPal. Take care, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.